ask you all to please turn off your mobile phones so that there is less disturbance during the discussion.
As was announced earlier,
Yes,
Ghosh,
that happens all the
it's
time.
which is a Bengali name, and Vishwajyoti is a graphic artist.
Yeah.
He's already done a novel called Delhi Calm, which is a graphic novel on the emergency in India, on the period of the emergency in India. And he's now curated this book, which is a collection of stories about the partition from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So this is not about one partition, it is about the partition and the splitting. And I think at a time when perhaps I grew up in a generation where the partition was always lived out, it still is, because a lot of my family is in Karachi, even though we are from UP, Lucknow, UP, and I've been raised in Delhi. But a lot of them are in Karachi, and so to us partition always appeared to be a tragedy. But for others it was liberation probably, and it was a celebration, and then certainly what happened in Bangladesh, there was another reality played out over there. Yet we constantly hear in India, and that partition is sort of perhaps necessary, and Rafay, who's an environmentalist, lawyer, activist.
And a cyclist.
And a cyclist. That's actually the most important thing. This potential of you cycling across the border.
I have cycled to it from Lahore. You can. It used to be done. It can still be done.
And Rafay has contributed in the book.
Yes.
And his story is so extraordinary that it's sort of, it's a modern day sort of Manto-esque kind of, because when I crossed the Wagah border this time, and I stood there and I looked here and I saw Jinnah looking at India, and I looked there and I saw Gandhi looking at Pakistan. I said, oh my God, this is my Toba Tek Singh moment. This is it. This is the maximum Toba Tek Singh I'm going to get. So Rafay could share that.
Yes. Although I understand I'm under some sort of... No, you have to go buy the book, so I'm only going to tell you. I'm not going to disclose the plot too much.
Okay. We are going to get to you later, because first the star of the book, which is really quite extraordinary, and I would sort of all of you must and I think you all must get a copy, because here is partition told in a very different, wacky, dark, artistic, simplistic, complex, anecdotal way. And so Vishwajyoti, tell us how you set about doing it and how did you start?
Well, I mean, I'm a graphic novelist. I'm audible, right?
Yes.
I'm a graphic novelist, and graphic novel as a form is very nascent in the subcontinent. We have just been doing 10 years of graphic novels in India. We have just about 10 books on the shelf, and graphic novels often come across as comics, and comics come across as a medium for children. So even my first book, which was about the political emergency of India, I've often found it in the children's section of the bookstores. They say, "Ha, comics hai, udhar chale jao," and then I see my book Delhi Calm next to Tintin and Asterix. So I'm in good company that way. So
selling as much, it's in
No, it's not selling as much as Tintin. I would be having my private jet in Lahore then. Yeah. But what's interesting is that we can use this form to tell a lot of stories in a very different way. Now, that does not necessarily mean just illustrated text, but also where the illustration, the drawing and the words come together and make a comment. So for me, that is really interesting, and the visual comment that can get, one is a political cartoon that you get in a newspaper, but then we're talking about a narrative, which is a sequential narrative that's moving from page to page. So for me, what is interesting is how do we talk history, how do we talk memory, how do we talk politics through such a medium. And one of the challenges that I felt was that when I opened this call for entry, and a lot of people actually were interested but apprehensive. And then they said, ki comics, partition, are you sure? And they did not send me the pieces.
But I still have to ask you this, because fundamentally, being a journalist, I can't help but be curious. There are so many people who ask you to do so many things, one never does it. How can you just open an entry and people send in their stuff?
Well, you'll be surprised. I mean, you'll be surprised. We got about 150 entries from.
You mean just spontaneous?
Yeah. I mean, we just opened a call for entry on a website and on a blog, and that's it. Yeah, and it was 150 entries. But most of the 150 entries, I mean, 125 stories would be the same story, the classic partition template, which would be violence and all that. So that's not a template we wanted to take. So that's when we started rethinking about our own brief, and that's how it started. Yeah.
Just one quick question I want to ask you is, at the point at which we stand in India today, why did you feel the need, your generation, your age, why do you want to look at the partition? It's done with. I mean, that's what people often say, for God's sake, another book on the partition, it's done with. Why did you want to do it? Huh?
I think it was an answer to, for God's sake, not another book on partition, because I really believe that partition is not a 47 thing, it's an ongoing thing. And the way we deal with partition is not only what happened in the history, but is also how we deal with our own narratives. I mean, if you've grown up in Delhi, and if you've grown up in Lahore or in Dhaka, and I was just talking this yesterday, that moment you would say, "Mere Dadaji kehte the," you would know he's talking about his old house in Lahore, he's talking about his old house in UP, or the lakha lakha di zameen he's left in Firozpur. That's a template we all grew up on. We are the third generation, and and we have also learned how to negotiate with memory. So for me, that is interesting. And then I mean, it happens all the time in our kitchens, in the way we talk with each other. Arey, wo to multani hai, usko kya pata? It's a very done thing, and for the next generation, they don't really know the difference between a multani or Peshawari or Lahori. I mean, and but they still use it as a term. So I mean, so there are so many different partitions that one comes across and one negotiates with. I don't think it's a piece of history that's gone into denial. I think it's a piece of history that's still being negotiated.
Absolutely. So now that you mentioned grandfather's house and grandmother's house, I mean, I cannot stop.
That's the grand old man.
There is a sort of complete mother of all story.
Thank you.
Which Rafay is going to share with us, which is so fascinating that it's. Please carry on.
Absolutely. Well, actually, the genesis of the story itself, I wrote this essay about my house. It has to do with partition. And it's interesting because I'm not old enough to have lived through partition, but I claim to have a partition story. But it was during a literature festival in India over a conversation over a bunch of people wondering about what Indian literature was and whether or not there are enough books to have a second or third of these things. And one sort of jokingly said, well, again, why book on partition? Because partition always sells.
Yeah.
All right, that's easy enough. I'll show you. I'll write a story about it. So what had happened is, I mean, I was very lucky. I was in London as an undergraduate student. I was studying law. And I lived in one of those student accommodations where students from other disciplines also lived. So I became friends with many people, including Martin, who was from India, and he was studying architecture. So we didn't have, he was a different school, he was different subjects, and he was actually one of my first Indian friends. I'd grown up here, went to school here, I'm very well conversed with Pakistan studies, and the very strong narrative that it has about India and Pakistan. So it was very interesting to get to know him. And over conversation one night, over many, we talked about where we were from and families, and he said that his grandparents' family were from Lahore. I go, oh, that's interesting, I'm from Lahore. Well, I lived in a place called Mall Road. Oh, really? I live on Mall Road as well. It seemed to be, coincidentally, as aise cheezein hoti rehti. And it was a few days later, I think Martin's father was in town. Martin must have told this to his father, and somehow the other, the penny clicked. And it transpires that I live in Martin's great-grandfather's house here on Bhavanatha Singh was a canal engineer. He retired in the early 1920s and also put some money together to build a house. Actually, at the time, between what they called Donaldtown, which is where Neela Gumbad is, and the cantonment, there was very little actually anything. There was just the Mall Road traveling through. So he must have bought an empty plot of land. It was a massive piece of land, and connected a little, the canal engineer, a little distribution channel, and obviously irrigated the area enough for it to be called Bawa Park. So the area I live in is still called Bawa Park. And I mean, it was very interesting. When I wrote about it, it was a moment to reflect. Because Martin would say, "Mujhe kiraya chahiye," and I was like, "Haan, main vakeel hu, main tumhe dekh lunga." But when I had a moment to reflect about it, it struck me that, I am a third generation or fourth generation Pakistani. My grandparents' relationship with partition is very different from mine. My grandmother and grandparents were actually in the assembly hall the night Mr. Nehru gave his Tryst for Destiny speech, as a matter of fact. So their experience of partition is very different than my father, who's sitting here, his experience with partition, and my own. I grew up with history books. I have no reason other than the prejudice in those history books to have an opinion about what's going on a cycle ride away from us. And so I felt that here's a partition story actually about finding a friend and realizing that if it weren't for this relatively arbitrary political line that divides us, we wouldn't have this story. So I have a partition story that's about friendship. It was interesting, we were at a sort of launch of Vishwa's book yesterday, and I was very lucky there were people asking me to sign it. It was great for the ego. And I couldn't help but writing in it, "I hope you enjoy my story." And I realized that I'm writing in a partition anthology, enjoy the story. It seems a bit odd, but this is what I think with people of my age and people younger than myself, that this is a real opportunity to realize that we are buffered from the prejudice of history. We should make our minds up about what India, or even who we are in this region, completely on our own. I was very lucky. Vishwa had arranged for me to participate in this year's Jaipur Literary Festival. And Jaipur it's an hour's flight from Lahore, but thanks to this arbitrary political line, I'll come back to why I keep on calling it that. Because of that line, it takes 8 hours to go to Jaipur. And I had the opportunity to show my daughter the palaces of Jaipur, which are so much a part of her tradition. And it seems so unfair that sitting so close, we can't do that. So there's a great need for this new narrative to form, and it's an evolution. As Vishwa said, we still grapple with partition. So we shouldn't leave it in the history books. I mean, we should certainly recognize it for the terrible human tragedy, civilizational tragedy that it was. But we need to learn how to grapple with it now and understand we're buffered ourselves. As Muhammad Ali once said, the boxer, "No Viet Cong ever called me nigger." I don't have a personal problem with anyone across the border, so I shouldn't let anything else influence how I think about it.
Thank you. Briefly, since I also have a book out there which will be launched, which is going to be launched tomorrow, which deals briefly with my own family's history. It's in the store, it's called In Good Faith. Then it goes on to another theme. Now, this is a Muslim landed family from Uttar Pradesh, where half the family migrates to Pakistan at the time of partition, again 3 generations ago. But how did we negotiate? At a child's level, what used to happen is when the visa regime would open up, all the Pakistanis would get the visas, and we'd say, "Oh my God, the Pakistanis are coming. We'll have to move out of our bedrooms," And then, as we grew up, there were differences in the way the Indians evolved and the way the Pakistanis evolved. At a very superficial level, Pakistanis were much more fashionable, the women. They were sort of, superficial. And we looked different, the Indians and the Pakistanis. The sort of attitudes were different as the generations evolved, and I think to some extent, simply there is no reference to it, but there may have been, I think people who go as refugees to a new land, they sometimes do fantastically well. And people who carry the weight of history and watch the trappings of their past being unraveled, They have a lot of intellectual angst about it. So people evolve differently. So there's been a fascinating...
That happened in Delhi. I mean, the whole economy of Delhi is still run by the lot that went from Pakistan. I mean, the divided India, and the whole Karol Bagh and the West Patel Nagar, which are the trader blocks, are actually the refugee colonies that began, and that's where the BJP emerged. And it's a fantastic project in itself, just to see those pockets, how they've evolved. I mean, I grew up in Lajpat Nagar, and even in the 70s, I think the vivid memory that I have of that place was that people would come back home from the central market with a hoarding, tin hoarding, and showing it to their neighbors, which would basically be a sign that they are opening up a shop. And for them, that was like, you know, we are coming on our own into the city. And that, I think it's what Chutai said, you know, from the days of being carefree, we had to go and make a living, whatever we get. I think that was the turning point of the refugee in any land. And that turning point, I think, has got hardwired genetically into a city. You know, which I find very interesting, especially in Delhi, because I've grown up in Lajpat Nagar, and I think it's a fate of Lajpat Nagar
I think
to
just
be.
to put it into context, Lajpat Nagar is a sort of very good Punjabi part of Delhi, which is not
A refugee part of Delhi.
And they've done very well. So the people who came from this side of the border, just to put it into context, have done very well. And I think many people who went from India have also done extremely well in Pakistan, though there is a Mohajir problem in Karachi where I was last year, in the midst of extraordinary violence. But anyway, so let's carry on.
No, I'm just talking about, I mean, you know, there are places which got slotted into a refugee colony forever. And Lajpat Nagar I've seen for being one, you know, I mean, it's that you had the refugees coming in, they've made something out of their lives, and they've made more than out of their lives. And I grew up in this small little pocket, a government piece of land called Kasturba Niketan, which was a Ministry of Rehabilitation Services. And that was basically meant for the widows of the eastern part who were rehabilitated here. And they were given dole and they were given dorms to live in. And now what has happened in the last 10 years, they have been given that piece of land to own. So now the refugees have become landowners there after 40 years. And they now built up these small little 10 by 10 rooms, which they now further rent it out to the Afghan tourists. And the rents would be at par with the GK, or which is the really posh parts of Delhi, and they're charging them in dollars. So, you know, and yeah, I mean, in Lajpat Nagar, now you see all the hoardings in Pushto and English. You don't see any Hindi or anything like that. So it's fascinating how they, and these are hardcore BJP areas, you know.
BJP being the right-wing party.
So, so money talks.
Money talks, absolutely. You know, in fact, in the Delhi, in the Max, which is the sort of most commercial Delhi chain, half the patients are now from Afghanistan, and they make such money out of there. Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq.
Yeah.
Most of the high-end hospitals, they just come there as medical tourism anyway. But you know, Vishwajyoti, I want to ask you one thing. As you've got this extraordinary collection of contributions, artists, graphic styles from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, which we have to dwell on a little later, did you find a difference in the style of storytelling, artist style, or is it all individual? Or do nations have their own graphic sort of skills?
No, I would call two nations have their graphic thing. I think two nations don't even know right now what is the graphic style. And thank God, I mean, you know, I've heard this question many times from the critics that Indian graphic novel is yet to find its own voice, which is the most fraudulent statement ever, because I thank God it does not have its own voice, because there are so many different voices, you know. So here you have books by folk artists who are reprocessing Ambedkar, who was one of the draftsperson of our constitution. And you have books which are talking about caste, which are talking about politics, which are talking about sexuality, and they're so different people in different styles. So I quite like it when it's so plural. So for me that was the challenge, is to bring out the diversity of different styles. And so
within India, we know a lot of things have been happening. I'm saying when you're dealing with Bangladesh.
Bangladesh and Pakistan, it was such a nascent form. So, you know, it was interesting to see, because people had heard about this form. So they wanted to work on it. So for me, that was the starting point. That if you want to work on it, then we can get together and work on it. So when there was this piece by Mahmood Farooqi, the Dastan Go, and he's reworked an Intizar Hussein's letter from Hindustan Se Ek Khat. And I asked him, why don't you convert this into a graphic form? And his first thing was, look, this is a performance piece. I'm not so sure. I said, why don't you give it a shot? We'll work with the artist from Pakistan. And we got this lady from Fariha Rahman, who's a miniature painter, who was based in Lahore then. And I said, look, this is a Dastan Go piece. She said, I don't know what Dastan Go is. So I shared her some videos. And then she just reprocessed it completely on her own. She never interacted with the author. And when I got those pages, I think, wow, I mean, she's just completely taken it on her own. And I think that's the beauty of it, that, people can just take it on their own and make something out of it within their own drawing style, which is not to compromise that, every comic does not have to be boxes and balloons, It can be long form text as well. So for me, that was interesting, how to use miniature in a graphic form, how to use mainstream comics in a graphic form, how to use poetry in a graphic form. So,
can I just say that I had no such difficulties, because I have to point out I didn't draw my story. I don't know how to.
Yeah, Martin,
the counterpart to my story, actually did the drawing. So ours is a sort of collaborative work.
You mean the guy who actually...
yeah, he did all the work for the story. I get to come on stage.
Yeah,
Martin is all Martin.
That's really quite an...
That's pushing the coincidence to the... Yeah.
I want to ask you now, you've now got involved in this sort of trying to understand India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, our histories, but you are an environmental lawyer and activist. So I just go off.
How much time do you have?
We have, I think, how much time do we have?
Last week I was in
20 minutes, okay, but I want to quickly, so don't take too much time.
The elevator pitch, sure. No,
how badly are any of these countries? Because I know that in India, especially if we're going to get a regime change, we're going to sort of slaughter the environment.
Are you sure about that?
This pro-development regime change about to happen. So just look, what's happening in Pakistan, Bangladesh, what is the sense of the models of development we're following? Very quickly, before we get back to...
Oh, we're going to hell in a handbasket. Every other Pakistani is in hospital because of impure drinking water. It's the #1 killer of Pakistanis today, but it's not a political issue. Look, I said this partition was an arbitrary line. They flew in a very talented lawyer from London and put him in a room for 3 weeks and said, here's the census from 41, draw a line connecting all the Muslim contiguous provinces. And he did. And at some point he completely overlooked the fact that he was drawing a political line and creating a riparian relationship over the largest gravity flow irrigation system and one of the oldest civilizations in the world. So in my mind, as I've come to learn more about this, partition of land happened in 47, partition of water happened in 1960 with the Indus Water Treaty. I was at Bangalore for this water conference, and there were two, Ramaswamy Iyer, the Minister of Water, actually called it a second partition. And here the significance is very important. The Himalayan, the Karakoram, the Hindu Kush mountain ranges provide water for close to 1 billion people. And that glacial melt or egress is going to affect us in 50, 60 years. Anyway, to bring it down, the last point I want to say, when we do talk about water and the environment in India and Pakistan, I'm very keen for people to understand that there are so many of our Sufi saints on that side of the border, and so many of the stories, even in the Mahabharata, sung on our riverbanks on this side of the border, that we tend to forget that we are all children of the monsoon. We all belong to the same ecosystem, much longer than this arbitrary political line. And that environmental conditions like quality of water are so important for us. It takes 8,000 calories, 8,000 liters of water to make a shirt. As people become more developed, as their incomes increase, their diets change. They'll move from grains to meats. A kilo of rice takes 2,000 liters of water. A kilo of meat takes 10,000 liters of water to produce. It's going to take an immense strain on our water resources and our ability to provide food. So we've got to take the second partition very seriously and start talking about it as well.
But now just, you're a Bengali, even though you've been raised in Delhi. I want to touch the issue of Bangladesh with you. Because that, in the way I grew up, we just kept on sort of, my grandmother agonized, my father agonized, every now and then everybody agonized over the India-Pakistan partition.
Yeah.
Urdu, poetry, kya hoga and all this. Nobody, where we come from, they didn't really give a thought to Bangladesh.
Yeah.
except that there was a war and there were political consequences. So now that, on the other hand, for people there, I don't think did they have a sense of civilizational loss? And or was it a necessary brink?
I think it was a loss of the land. I think it was a loss of. I think the biggest loss that part of the world faced was the loss of their rivers. I think that was something that really moved and shook them, and that's exactly what happened. Because Bangladesh is a very riverine population. They have ponds and canals all over the place. So every family, every zamindar family in Bangladesh would have 4 canals or 4 ponds around him, and the working class would have the same. And from there they had to move, and then they moved to West Bengal, where the government said, no, we can't keep you, this is too much of pressure on our land, and they were landlocked into the central India, which is no rivers, it's absolute desert-turned agrarian population and absolute forest, which is the Dandakaranya, where the whole red corridor is right now. And what happened was that it was that loss of rivers that really shook them, and in 75 or 71 they went back, they rebelled, the refugees rebelled, and these were all, refugee problem has always existed, not in terms of the affluent, because affluents have figured out a way to deal with themselves, but the lasting legacies of refugees have always been with the lower classes and the castes in India.
Right.
And so this whole lot went back as a as an act of rebellion, and they went back to Sundarbans because they wanted the river so desperately. And that's was the time when the government actually ordered a state massacre in a place called Marichapi. So we're talking about 71. No, 75. 75. I'm talking about 75. And on 26th January 75, which is our Republic Day. So when we talk about state pogrom, as we call it now in 84 and 2002, it's actually started in 75 by neither the BJP nor the Congress, but the left. And it's completely erased from the public memory. So, what has happened is that, yes, there has not been that much of a discussion, especially in Delhi, which is the publishing capital in that sense, that, that we talk about that, Bangladesh has often been ignored. But in Bengali literature, there's been a lot of talk, work on it. And
If you pick up my book, I've traveled a lot in that area, and I've done the Sundarbans Indian part and the Bengal part, and I've written about the joint traditions. In
fact, that river.
I'm not Bangladesh, but I'm aware that people from the northern Indian belt, or even Pakistan, would not have a civilizational sense of Bangladesh.
Yeah, but and not only that, it's also the people in Bangladesh often do not reflect on it as well, because when we were looking for stories, and I did get in touch with a lot of young writers, and I asked them that we are doing this book on partition, would you like to send a story? Most of them said, I was too young during the war, I don't remember much about the war. But for them, it was all about 71.
Yeah.
So even the memory is like partition. So life does not begin before 71.
For them.
Yeah.
But again, this is now based on impressions. We always used to think that Bangladesh was a sort of basket case of this whole region. But in so many ways, in so many areas, they've they have a lot of problems, and there'll be a constant influx of refugees into India and the northeastern part of India. But they have a lot of problems, but they're picking themselves up. The indicators are getting better and better.
Yeah,
And so
they're
it's
taking
really
away
it's
a lot of
so
them.
good to see that happening in
I wanted to just touch on that point that Vishwa was saying, this erasure of history, because here the dominant sense of partition is 1947.
Right.
And 1971 is not considered a partitioning of the country, although it
Right.
is. In Vishwa's book, it's clear that the Bengali contributors think of their Azadi as 71. They don't really think of partition in 47. And it was very interesting in Jaipur with another author, K. Anis from Bangladesh, and we were asked more or less very directly about 1971. And I said, in Pakistan there's an erasure of history. My generation really doesn't know about it. I was born shortly after 71. It's not a part of how we interact with one another. 47 very much is. Yeah. So this is another part of our own history that is erased and we don't negotiate with.
Yeah, it's also a partitioning of a lot of our histories and memories. And it's across the 3 countries, and it's also the same history books. It would be just a nice project to just look at the 3 history books, talking about the same piece of history that moves.
But it depends on whose history, because there will be one version which is a very romantic, angst-ridden version of people like my family. But then, you know, the issue of feudalism is not touched, so we won't go there. You know, the issue of that is not touched.
No, even talking about official histories can be very interesting. Just to see a very comparative thing of the official histories, I think it will be very interesting. How it's like a Rashomon, as I've often said, you know, it's a Kurosawa film. The footage is the same, but you keep editing it as per your convenience.
Yeah, but I think within India you'll have another history of the Hindu right.
Yeah,
Looks at the whole events very, very differently, and they are a very important school of thought now. I mean, you know, they have their own version of history.
Absolutely, yeah.
And in Pakistan also, your books and your I gather, there have been various interpretations of history in Pakistan. About,
there is a very strong, dominant history. You know, it jumps leaps and bounds. It starts with Muhammad bin Qasim coming to Sindh, and then leaps and bounds to Aurangzeb, and leaps and bounds to 1947, and all these things in between are forgotten. And you know, it's 47, then there's a 65 war, 71 loss, and then all of a sudden you're in modern day. That's the sort of history that's given to us, with very little context in between.
But do the history books change with regimes? Because that happens in India.
I think the textbook board makes enough money to be impervious to politics. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Government and done very aggressive changes which the NP government has brought in, and the PTI government has brought in very aggressive policies regarding jihad and all that.
They would change it, right?
They would change it.
You know, I just want to make, since we're two Indians, so let me just give you a point of view, and I'm always sensitive to Pakistan, having half a family here.
I'm half Lahori, by the way.
You know, but just one, I mean, obviously, and you know, with if you're creating a new state, and that state is called Pakistan, that is the flow, you have to create a history.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, the project, whoever envisaged the project is going to fail. So Pakistan would have had to have history. It would be a far more complex.
Yes, absolutely. I mean,
you know,
Jesus Christ was born,
Yeah.
and then he was 30 and he died.
Yeah.
And Muhammad Ali Jinnah was born, he studied under lamplight, and then he formed a country. There's a need to create this deification. There's a very strong need to create this.
But that would be across all nations. Even our freedom fighters all studied under the lamp and they swam their way to the school. With books in one hand.
No, but I think it's slightly more because you have so many people. You have the left view of history, you have the right wing view of history, you have people who openly abuse Gandhi, you have those who say Ambedkar was greater. So you know, you don't have that kind of clear-cut plan to do a history, but it could change with
Absolutely. No, the closer you look
at
at
your nation. You're the only country in the world in the name of Islam, a religion. You have to. I think the project in Pakistan has been quite forceful.
Yeah,
to write history. I mean, it's nothing compared to what we would have understood. It would be a forceful project, you know. So, should I, how much time, I'm losing track of time, you know. I think we'd like to open up and just get some questions in, so 10 minutes more.
So we can just open it up.
So I think,
I don't think your mic is on. Is it on?
The need to, in Pakistan, to actually create a totally new identity. And you can't compare it with whatever is happening in the rest of the world, because I think the great deal of what is happening in Pakistan today, the confusion, the lack of the loss of bearing and the lack of rootedness, is because of this whole, it was a whole very conscious exercise to create a new identity, which was definitely very, very anti-Indian, anything to do with the subcontinent, which looked towards Arab-centric, which sort of skipped over Iran, which was very much a part of the subcontinental culture, the influences, the Persian influences, and we went direct to the wastelands of Saudi Arabia, and Muhammad bin Qasim, as Rafay rightly said, that's where our history started, the conquests of Muhammad bin Qasim, and then of course Mahmud Ghaznavi's 17 Hamlas, which was so glorified. And I think that cannot be dismissed so easily that this happens everywhere. I think it happens in the most dangerous way in Pakistan. and which has really resulted in the mess that we see.
I agree with you entirely.
But here, see, it's been 60 years of prejudice. So if you take a longer-term view of this, I mean, it was done as a deliberate exercise, so if one has the means and mechanisms, it's a deliberate exercise to prejudice the other way. And if you do it a little better, it'll take 30 years. So if you take a longer-term view of this, this is not a long-term problem for Pakistan, this is very much a solvable problem. This issue of perceptions and how we read our history and what we've been fed. So there has to be an alternative discourse, there has to be a better understanding of something like partition. The history that we have is very much the dominant discourse which was building up this nascent nation. But for instance, as I learn more about partition, I'm becoming more aware of the fact that, look, in our part of the world, here in Punjab, land is unbelievably important. And for the people who lived in Lahore and Amritsar, who had no idea till June, July 1947 that they would be deprived of their land, you know, why would somebody, the deaths of hundreds of thousands and millions of people only happens when you trigger something very raw in humanity.
Yeah.
So we've got to look back, and it's why would we do this? We don't do this now. Why would we have done this? We've got to keep on asking these questions. And I hope everyone else gets a partition story of their own, which isn't rooted in the sort of dominant discourse. Break it apart, and then you'll start working on the 60 years of
you know, in our history books, our history is often, not often actually, most of the time starts with the Indus Valley civilization, because that's where man was born, and it always says that's where we began from, and then in brackets it says now in Pakistan.
had a very good pipe system, aajkal nahi. That's when Mohenjo-daro comes in reference over here.
For a plumber.
That and festivals.
Let's get, please.
Just two questions. You said you got 150 entries.
Yeah.
And 120 or whatever majority was the same traditional template. What about the rest? Did it follow a very liberal narrative, or how was the richness?
Well, you know, our focus was not only about what had happened, because there's a lot of literature and film and music and stuff that is around theatre based and all that. But our brief was also to understand how the subsequent generations have worked their own family histories or memories. How have they negotiated with it? That's what we were actually looking for. Because I believe that every story of partition is actually a translation. Because it's been translated from the witness to subsequent generations. And it must have changed its flavor somewhere. So how do we deal with that? I think that was my brief for myself. And so that's why we have a story like Rafay, which is absolutely a third generation coincidence. This kind of thing only happens in Manmohan Desai films in Bombay. You know, wo mandir mein ghanti bajti hai and dono bhai mil jate hain. So for me that was a moment of partition. And there's another story we had. It's about this Bengali family who was in Karachi, and they were in 71, and this guy was 9 or 13. And they realized, oh man, we are in Pakistan, it's not the same country, we have another country called Bangladesh, we have to get out of this place fast. So they hatch a conspiracy theory, all the Bengalis of Karachi get together, they have a conspiracy theory, they get a fixers, they get the sheikhs and the Pathans who will take them from point to point, and they decide to go via Quetta. In Quetta, they send the kids, these two boys, to go and buy the tickets, because if the adults go, they'll get caught. So they go and send this guy, and they'll send him with a brief to go and buy 41 tickets. So you know where this is going. So you know, they made it. But you know, for me, those parts of partition are also as interesting. You know, as how do we negotiate with food? How do we negotiate with sports? How do we negotiate with romance? And these are so linked with partition. I mean, there was a story from Bangladesh about this Chittagong boy who came, falls in love with this girl in Calcutta. And it's a modern day story, it's a real story where, and the reason that girl got attracted to him because he was from Chittagong. And her family was from Chittagong. Graduation khatam, okay bye. Poor guy is now in Dhaka. They're not even Facebook friends. You know, that's also a partition story. So for me, you know, these are also interesting points of partition which we need to look into.
So when we read the history of Indo-Pak in our textbooks, it was not starting with the 1947 history, it always started with Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's movement and the concept of two-nation theory, the earlier movement. And that basically led to the basic dichotomy, and that led to the whole concept of separation from the difference between Hindus and Muslims, and the whole thing. So it was pretty interesting for me to learn that Motilal Nehru, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, Pandit Vinod, and Prince Aga Khan III had something in common. And that happened to be in an AF lodge in Mumbai. So I would like to question you about that, if you're familiar with any other literature that may be able to find in this regard, and what is your perspective on that?
On what?
On the common grounds of friendships of people who were of totally different ideologies, and they were under the same watch.
You're absolutely right. There's actually a couple of great stories. One is how Khushwant Singh, the great Indian journalist and writer, left Lahore during 1947, and he was dear friends. He used to be a lawyer. He was a lapsed lawyer. He spent 12 years as a lawyer, and then became a journalist. And I'm reaching my 12th year, and I'm getting ideas. So he was very good friends with Manzoor Qadir Saab, who was Pakistan's law minister, early after party, and foreign minister as well. And the third friend was G.D. Khosla, who was also a lawyer and judge of the High Court. G.D. Khosla is my friend Martin's grandfather. G.D. Khosla also wrote the book Stern Reckoning on Partition.
Right.
And Manzoor Qadir Saab stayed back in Lahore, and Khushwant Singh and G.D. Khosla Saab went to India. And in 1951, Khushwant Singh got a message to please come to Amritsar. Manzoor Qadir Saab had kept all of his belongings during the rioting, protected them himself, and as foreign minister arranged to have them all delivered to Khushwant Singh Saab afterwards. He also took care, this is a lesser known footnote, of G.D. Khosla Saab's house, the one that we live in.
That's lovely.
Here.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of these, so if you go back, G.D. Khosla Saab's name is on the board in the Lahore High Court as the president of the High Court Library. This history exists in us today.
It does, but I haven't mentioned this before, but I came here in 2006 with an extraordinary visa, which was allowed an Indian journalist to travel into the Punjab, because there was an interest that I should go to Manmohan Singh's village. He was born in Punjab, so I actually traveled, and then I went off and I interviewed the Prime Minister at that time in Pakistan, Foreign Minister. And I went to the village, and why was this whole establishment interested from India and from Pakistan? One journalist should get a visa. Just find out where the Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh is the Prime Minister, and right now the Prime Minister, that is where he left when he was 10 years old. So I land up in this village where, they're all waiting and welcoming, and they find an old book and where he had signed, and there's a school, and there is an Indian environmental company called Terry. Terry is doing some electrification program. Really? And it was fascinating, because where in India do you land up in the morning and you get offered nihari, kebab, mutton, chicken? It doesn't happen. So there I was in the morning.
Not even in the PMO.
No. It doesn't happen. So in the morning only guys. I never saw a woman there, but that's another matter. But they were all there giving me from subah se sham tak nihari kebab, thing, and talking about Hindi cinema. And all of them said, my parents remember Manmohan Singh. Okay. But it happened. Things became so sad. One thing after the other. I did the story. I went back and I described this village. I did the story. He just could never come to Pakistan. Things are so bad. Things have just spilled out of control. There was a series of bomb blasts in Indian trains in Mumbai. And the whole project went for a toss. The entire thing. So, these are touching memories we carry, but the realities that we live with.
When the last press conference, he said, I would like to go to Pakistan before my tenure ends, which is like a month from now. And,
He'll never be able to go.
I don't think,
He'll never be able to go. And let's not forget, when the Indian politician Lal Krishna Advani came here, and then he went back, he was destroyed. Because he went and said nice things about Jinnah. He never recovered from that. So coming to Pakistan, and he was also born and raised in Karachi, I think. He was educated there.
Yeah.
So, these are nice memories, but the politics is so we have to negotiate things at so many levels. And but just one more question for Vishwajyoti.
Excuse me, I just have two questions, Vishwajyoti, and those are rather on the medium in the subject.
Thank God.
One, I am seeing a lot of Joe Sacco and Will Eisner here. So if you know just inspiration or something, and I want to know about your inspiration. Secondly, if somebody has done work, where do we get publishers? Because frankly, in India, you have Comic-Con Bangalore and you have Comic-Con Mumbai, and you have this whole lot of, 10, 20 graphic novelists. But here, if I do consider myself one, I do not know any other one who's doing the stuff. Or where do I go with my stuff to get published?
You got a Vishwajyoti.
I'm not a publisher, but my publisher is here, by the way. What I can say is, 10 years back, it was the same situation there. And one person started working on it, influenced 5 of us, and that's how it started working. But what we did was, at that point of time, because we knew that the publishing scene was not really ready, what we would do is we would do small little stories and publish them in magazines and newspapers just to create a critical mass of such stories. And the first 4 years that the reactions we got was like, man, that's not even funny. So you have to deal with that. My only suggestion is that the publishers are far more open to graphic novels than they were 10 years back. They are experimenting with the form, and I think it's an important moment for the subcontinent to dwell on. And I just hope that there are more books soon. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, basically...
One
more question.
I was struck by what you said, Ghosh, that in the partition is not a story that has ended, rather it's an ongoing story. Really, it's so true. It's very encouraging to see people of your generation thinking about it, being involved. Who do you think benefits the most by this ongoing war between India and Pakistan? Who benefits the most, in your opinion?
देखिए मसला ये है कि टेंशन नहीं होगी तो बहुत लोगों की दुकान बंद हो जाएगी.
वो कौन लोग हैं जिनकी दुकान बंद हो जाएगी?
दोनों मुल्कों में बहुत I was playing cards in Lahore in 2008, and this friend of mine from Lahore, he won, and he trumped the card and he said, "This is for Victory Day 1965. So I said, "What happened on Victory Day 1965? He said, "We won the war." And he said, "Yeah, मैंने कहा हमने स्कूल में पढ़ा, we won the war." So, no, who won the war? We don't know. But the fact remains, this guy won the game of cards. The whole thing is that nervous headlines make good news. That's the truth. I have no reason. I have no reason why trade can't happen between these two countries. We all buy shan masalas when we go from here. Sunil Sethi had done a piece sometime back when he was coming to Lahore or something, and he's a journalist, and he just called up a few friends and he said, "I'm coming to Lahore. Do you need anything?" And the entire list he got, he made a column out of that. And it was like kurtas, juti, there's no reason why the interactions can't happen. I think the bus thing is a great initiative. I really am mad. But my point is that, there has to be far more, and there are a lot of civil society initiatives that are happening. Many, which don't get covered. But unless there's a political will that we have to make something out of the subcontinent, I don't think it's 8 steps forward and 16 steps back. I think that's about it.
Yeah. I think that's it, but I think you've taken many steps forward with it. And it's a fantastic book, so thank you.
I just think what a Delhiwala has to do is the last word counter, and Rafay is there for signing. Thank you.
Sign? Yeah. Sign it.